A mother's love knows no limits. But what if her love isn't meant to protect you, but to control you? You've heard the stories of Sean Diddy Combs, the success, the fame, the empire. But what if I told you that behind the glitz and glamour lies a darkness most can't comprehend? A secret rooted in his childhood, in the watchful eyes of his mother, and the horrors of one night that changed everything. This isn't the Sean you know. This is the boy I grew up with, the friend I watched walk into the abyss, a boy who trusted his mother more than anything until she brought him to his first freak-off, a ritual that stripped him of more than just his innocence. What I saw that night still haunts me. The smiles, the chanting, the figure that rose from the shadows. It wasn't just a party, it was a sacrifice. And Sean, he was the offering. Are you ready to hear what really happened? Let me take you back to where it all began, to Diddy's first freak. Sean Combs wasn't always the larger-than-life figure you see on magazine covers and hear on the radio. Back then, to me, he was just Sean, a skinny, scrappy kid from Mount Vernon who could run faster and argue louder than anyone I'd ever met. We were inseparable in those days, two kids navigating a neighborhood that could be as unforgiving as it was alive. But if there was one constant in Sean's world, it was his mother, Ms. Janice Combs. Janice was the kind of woman who turned heads when she walked into a room. It wasn't just her looks, though she was beautiful, always impeccably dressed, with her hair perfectly styled. It was her presence. She carried herself with a confidence that said she could handle whatever life threw her way, and in Mount Vernon, that was no small feat. After all, she was raising Sean and his sister Keisha on her own, after the tragedy that had shattered their family. Sean's father, Melvin Combs, had been killed in a shooting when Sean was just 2 years old. I remember the first time Sean told me about it, his voice low as if sharing a secret. He got shot in his car, he said, shrugging like it was just another fact of life. That was Sean. He carried his pain quietly, always trying to look tougher than he felt. But even if he didn't talk about it much, you could see the loss in the way he looked at his mom, like she was all the world had left to give him. And Janice gave him everything she could. She worked as a model and a teacher's assistant, juggling jobs to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. She was the kind of mom who always showed up, whether it was for Sean's football games at Mount St. Michael Academy or just to make sure he stayed out of trouble. "She's my best friend," Sean would tell me, his chest puffed out with pride. "Nobody's got a mom like mine." Sean worshiped her, and honestly, I couldn't blame him. Janice had this way of making you feel like you were the center of the universe when she talked to you. But she wasn't just warm, she was resourceful. I'd seen her talk down angry landlords, charm her way into getting deals at the corner store, and stand up to anyone who dared cross her or her kids. She was a force of nature, and Sean idolized her for it. "She's my hero," he told me once, his voice softer than usual. "She's the only person who's ever got my back. She makes me feel like I can do anything." I believed him too. When you were around Janice, you couldn't help but feel like the world was just a little bit brighter, like things might actually turn out okay. But looking back now, I wonder if that brightness was hiding something darker, a shadow just waiting to creep in. If there was one thing you could count on in Mount Vernon, it was seeing Ms. Janice Combs somewhere close to Sean. She was everywhere, like a shadow that stretched just a little too long, always hovering just out of reach. It didn't matter if we were at school, playing football on the neighborhood field, or just walking to the corner store. Janice always seemed to know where Sean was. At first it felt normal, even comforting. But as time went on, I started noticing how her presence wasn't just frequent, it was constant. At school, I'd catch glimpses of her standing near the fence during recess, her sharp eyes scanning the yard until they landed on Sean. Sometimes she'd pop up during class hours, peering through the window like she was making sure he was still there. The teachers never said a word about it, almost like they expected her visits. Sean would wave at her casually like it was no big deal, but I could never shake the feeling that she wasn't just checking in. In the neighborhood, it was the same story. If Sean and I were hanging out at the park, it wouldn't be long before I'd spot her sitting on a nearby bench, pretending to read a magazine, but keeping one eye on us. When we'd wander off to grab candy from the corner store, she'd somehow show up as we walked back, calling out Sean's name like she just happened to be in the area. At first, we laughed about it. "She's got radar," Sean joked once. "Knows where I'm at no matter what." But even he couldn't explain how she seemed to know everything we did, everywhere we went. It wasn't just about keeping him out of trouble. She had this way of watching that felt deliberate, like she was studying him. The kind of studying you do when you're expecting something to happen, not just keeping tabs. Sean didn't mind it, or at least he acted like he didn't. He'd shrug off my questions saying, "She's just being a mom. You don't get it. She's got to make sure I'm good." And maybe that was true. But to me, it started to feel like more than that. There was an intensity in her eyes when she looked at him, a sharpness that went beyond love or pride. It was like she saw something in Sean that the rest of us couldn't, something she was waiting for. Sometimes when she thought no one was looking, I'd catch her watching him with this strange expression, almost like she was both protecting him and expecting him to fulfill some unspoken purpose. I didn't want to say anything, but it started to bother me. It wasn't normal, the way she was always there, always watching. It made me wonder, was it Sean she was worried about? Or was it something she was afraid might happen to him or through him? Even as a kid, I couldn't shake the feeling that her love wasn't just protective. It was purposeful, deliberate, and maybe even a little bit dangerous. It wasn't often that Sean opened up about his mom. He'd joke about her being overprotective or brag about how she always had his back. But when it came to the deeper stuff, the things that didn't sit right, he usually kept that to himself. Until one afternoon when it all came spilling out. We'd been walking home from school, cutting through the park to avoid the main roads. Sean had been quiet all day, uncharacteristically distracted, like something was eating at him. Finally, as we sat on a bench, he broke the silence. "You ever feel like you don't know someone?" Sean asked suddenly, his voice low. "Like you think you know everything about them, but then one day, it's like they're a stranger?" I frowned, confused by his tone. "What are you talking about? Your mom?" He nodded, looking down at his shoes. "Yeah, I mean, she's my mom. She's everything. But sometimes I feel like there's stuff she doesn't tell me. Stuff I'm not supposed to know." I waited, letting him find the words. Sean wasn't the type to admit he was scared, not even to me. "There's this one time at church," he began, hesitating. "You know how I help out on the altar sometimes, right? Well, last week I saw her looking at me from the pews. She had this look on her face, man. It wasn't proud or happy or anything like that. She looked mad. Or, I don't know, like she was disgusted. That took me by surprise." "Disgusted? Are you sure?" Sean nodded slowly. "Yeah, like she didn't like seeing me up there or something. But then, as soon as I looked at her, she changed. Gave me this big smile like nothing was wrong. But I know what I saw. I didn't know what to say. The idea of Miss Janice looking at Sean like that didn't make sense. She adored him. Anyone could see that. But the way Sean said it, I knew he wasn't making it up. And it's not just that," Sean continued, his voice dropping even lower. There's stuff she does at night. Weird stuff." I leaned in closer. "What kind of stuff?" He hesitated, glancing around like someone might overhear us. "Sometimes I wake up and she's in the living room. She's got these candles lit, black ones, and these like symbols drawn on the floor. I don't know what they mean, but they're not normal. And she's saying these words, but they're not in English. I don't even think they're words. It's like she's chanting or something. A chill ran down my spine. You sure she's not just praying or something? You said she's religious, right? Sean shook his head. It's not like that. It's not like anything I've ever seen before. It's like she's trying to, I don't know, talk to something or someone. He looked at me then, his eyes wide and uncertain. And every time I ask her about it, she just says it's nothing. Don't worry about it, Sean, she says. It's just something I do to keep us safe. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, betraying the fear he was trying to hide. I want to believe her, but man, it doesn't feel like she's keeping us safe. It feels like something else. I didn't know what to say. Ms. Janice had always seemed so put together, so confident and loving, but the way Sean described her, it was like she was a completely different person when no one else was looking. Do you think she's into something bad? I asked cautiously. Sean shrugged, running a hand over his face. I don't know. I don't want to think that. She's my mom, she's all I got. But sometimes I just don't know her anymore. For a moment, we sat in silence, the weight of his words pressing down on both of us. Finally, Sean forced a smile and stood up, trying to shake it off. She's just trying to protect us, he said, his voice uneven. That's all it is. She's just being a mom. But as he said it, I could tell he didn't believe it, not entirely, and neither did I. It started with a phone call. Sean rarely called me after school. We usually just met up somewhere. But that day, his voice sounded different, quieter than usual, almost cautious. My mom's having a party tomorrow night, he said. A special one. I paused, confused. Janice's parties were already something else. Loud, extravagant, and impossible to ignore. How could one of her parties be special? What do you mean, special? I asked. Sean hesitated. It's not like her usual ones. It's, I don't know, different. She told me I could stay downstairs this time. Said I'm old enough to be part of it now. I could hear a mix of pride and uncertainty in his voice. For as long as I'd known Sean, Janice had always kept him out of her parties. He'd peek through the banister or listen from his room, but he was never allowed to join. Now, it sounded like she was finally letting him in, and he wasn't sure what to make of it. You want me to come? I asked, though I wasn't sure why he'd want me there. Yeah, Sean said quickly. It's important. I mean, she didn't exactly say you could come, but just sneak in. It'll be fine. The way he said it made me uneasy, but I agreed anyway. When it came to Sean, I always did. The next night, I slipped out of my house and headed toward Sean's. From the moment I turned onto his street, I could tell something was different. Usually you could hear one of Janice's parties from a block away, music blaring, people laughing, the energy spilling out onto the street. But this time, the house was quiet. Too quiet. When I reached the front door, Sean was already there, waiting for me. He didn't look like himself. His usual easy grin was gone, replaced with a tight, nervous expression. You made it, he said, forcing a smile. What's going on? I asked, glancing at the house. Where's the music? Sean shrugged. She said this one's more private. Come on, let's go inside. The moment I stepped through the door, I knew this wasn't like any of Janice's other parties. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, like the house itself was holding its breath. The usual warm lighting was gone, replaced by dim candles that cast long, flickering shadows across the walls. And the guests, they weren't dressed in flashy clothes like they usually were. Instead, they wore flowing black robes with deep hoods that obscured their faces. They moved slowly and deliberately, their voices low and murmuring in a language I didn't understand. Who are these people? I whispered to Sean. He shook his head. I don't know. I've never seen them before. We stood at the edge of the living room, watching as the robed figures gathered in a circle around a strange symbol painted on the floor. The symbol glowed faintly, its intricate lines shimmering like they were alive. What is this, Sean? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Sean looked as uneasy as I felt, but there was something else in his expression too, something like pride. "She says I'm ready now," he said. "She says it's time for me to be part of it." "Part of what?" He didn't answer. Instead, he led me deeper into the house, toward the circle. As we walked, I noticed how the robed figures turned to watch us, their hooded faces tilting in unison like they were all sharing the same thought. Janice was standing at the center of the circle, her usual confidence amplified into something almost regal. She looked up as we approached and smiled, but it wasn't the warm, welcoming smile I was used to. It was sharper, colder. "There you are, Sean," she said, her voice smooth and commanding. "Right on time." Sean hesitated, glancing back at me. "This is my friend," he said quickly. "He's here to watch." Janice's eyes flicked to me, her smile fading for just a moment before she nodded. "Fine," she said. "Let him watch. But don't forget why you're here, Sean. Tonight is important. You have a role to play." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I looked at Sean, but he was already stepping forward, his shoulders stiff with nervous determination. I stayed where I was, watching as Sean joined the circle. The air seemed to grow heavier, the flickering candlelight dimming as the robed figures began to chant in low, rhythmic voices. I wanted to leave, but something kept me rooted to the spot. Curiosity, fear, or maybe the growing sense that whatever was about to happen, it was already too late to stop it. The chanting began low and steady, filling the air with a sound that seemed to vibrate in my chest. It wasn't music, but it had a rhythm to it, something primal, ancient, and entirely wrong. Sean was standing in the circle now, surrounded by the robed figures who swayed in unison to the haunting cadence. I stayed by the doorway, frozen in place, unsure if I should run or stay. And then he walked in. He wasn't dressed like the others. No black robe, no hood to hide his face. Mr. Gray stood out in every way. His suit was immaculately tailored, but it looked wrong somehow. Too sharp, too clean, like it didn't belong in this world. He was tall and gaunt, with skin so pale it almost seemed translucent. His cheekbones jutted out sharply, and his eyes, a cold, steely gray, scanned the room with a detached kind of authority. The moment he stepped into the room, the chanting stopped. Every head turned toward him, and the robed figures bowed their heads in unison, their movements eerily synchronized. "Sean," Mr. Gray said, his voice smooth and deliberate, like he was tasting every syllable. "Welcome." Sean stiffened, his back straightening as he turned to face the man. "Thank you," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. Mr. Gray's lips curled into a thin smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He walked slowly toward Sean, his movements precise, almost mechanical. His gaze flicked to me for a brief moment, and I felt my stomach drop. It was like he saw straight through me, past my skin and bones, into something deeper that I didn't even know existed. "And who is this?" he asked, his tone neutral, but somehow still sharp enough to cut. Sean hesitated. "He's my friend," he said quickly. "I wanted him to, be here." Mr. Gray's smile widened, and I felt the air grow colder. "A witness, then," he said. "Very well. Perhaps it's better this way." Without another word, he gestured for us to follow him. Sean moved immediately, but I hesitated, my legs refusing to cooperate. Mr. Gray glanced back at me, raising an eyebrow. "Come along," he said, his voice calm, but carrying an undeniable command. I didn't want to go, but something about the way he spoke left no room for argument. My feet moved before I could stop them, carrying me deeper into the house, deeper into whatever this was. The room he led us to was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. The air felt thick, heavy with the scent of burning herbs and something metallic. Blood, maybe. The walls were lined with flickering black candles, their flames unnaturally still despite the draft I could feel brushing against my skin. In the center of the room was a large circle painted on the floor, its intricate symbols glowing faintly with an eerie, otherworldly light. The lines pulsed gently, almost like they were alive. At the circle's edge stood a pedestal, and on it sat a chalice. It was made of some dark, glossy material that shimmered in the candlelight, and it was filled with a thick, dark liquid. The smell of it hit me even from a distance. Sweet and metallic, like overripe fruit mixed with rust. Mr. Gray stepped into the room, his presence immediately filling the space. The robed figures followed, taking their places around the circle. Sean and I were left standing near the doorway, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. "This," Mr. Gray said, gesturing to the circle, "is a sacred space. Tonight we honor the one who has given us everything. We honor the prince." The room fell deathly silent, the weight of his words pressing down on me like a physical force. "The prince has watched over us," Mr. Gray continued, his voice rising slightly. "He has granted us power, wealth, freedom, and tonight he will accept our gratitude and our offerings." He turned to Sean, his cold eyes locking onto him. "You," he said, his voice softer now, almost reverent. "You are the one chosen for this honor. Your role tonight is vital." Sean swallowed hard, his hands twitching nervously at his sides. What do I have to do?" he asked. Mr. Gray's smile returned, thin and sharp. "You will stand in the circle," he said. "You will drink from the chalice, and you will open yourself to the prince. He will see you, and he will know you." Sean looked back at me, his eyes wide with fear. For a moment, I thought he might refuse, might walk away. But then he nodded slowly, stepping forward. The robed figures began to chant again, their voices low and rhythmic. The symbols on the floor pulsed brighter, the light from the circle casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. As Sean stepped into the circle, I felt a chill run down my spine. The room seemed to darken, the candle flames dimming as if something was sucking the light out of the air. Mr. Gray turned to me then, his cold gaze piercing through me once more. "You may watch," he said, his voice as smooth as glass, "but do not interfere." I couldn't move, couldn't speak. All I could do was watch as Sean knelt before the chalice, his trembling hands reaching for it. The chanting grew louder, more frenzied, the air vibrating with the sound. And then, as Sean lifted the chalice to his lips, the glow from the circle flared, bathing the room in an unnatural golden light. My stomach churned, and I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. This was no honor. This was something far darker, far worse. And Sean was at the center of it. The air in the room became impossibly heavy as Sean lifted the chalice to his lips. The liquid inside shimmered unnaturally, as if it were alive. His hands trembled as he drank, the thick substance clinging to his lips like oil. The chanting reached a fever pitch, the robed figures swaying violently, their movements jerky and inhuman. Then, the glow from the circle exploded in intensity, blinding for a moment before dimming into a sinister, pulsing light. A deep, guttural sound echoed from within the circle, a sound that wasn't quite a growl nor a voice. It was something ancient and incomprehensible, resonating in a way that made my bones feel like they might shatter. And then it emerged. At first, it was just a shadow rising from the circle, stretching unnaturally upward. But as the light shifted, the shadow became solid. A figure towered over us, its form impossibly skeletal, as though its blackened flesh had been stretched taut over a frame too large for it. Its limbs were grotesquely long, its arms hanging past its knees, with fingers that ended in glistening, razor-sharp claws. Its head tilted slightly as it rose to its full height, scraping the ceiling. Its face was almost featureless, a horrifying void save for one terrible detail, a grin. Its mouth stretched impossibly wide, jagged and cruel, revealing rows of needle-like teeth that seemed to shimmer in the flickering candlelight. Molten gold eyes burned within its shadowed sockets, scanning the room with an intelligence that felt far too knowing. The creature moved with an eerie grace, each step unnervingly fluid. Its massive frame should have made it lumbering, clumsy, but instead it glided, its movements unnaturally smooth and deliberate. The smile never wavered, not for a second, as if it were amused by all of us. by everything it saw. The chanting abruptly stopped. Silence filled the room, so thick it felt alive. The robed figures dropped to their knees in unison, bowing so low that their foreheads nearly touched the floor. Their hands reached upward, trembling as they stretched toward the figure like desperate supplicants. And then the degradation began. One by one, the guests began to offer themselves. They crawled forward, their movements pathetic and animalistic, tearing at their robes to expose their flesh. They wept, moaned, and whispered incoherent pleas. Some prostrated themselves at the demon's feet, while others clawed at their own skin, drawing blood in their frenzy to prove their devotion. The creature didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its grin widened ever so slightly, and the golden light in its eyes flickered with what could only be described as pleasure. It raised one elongated hand, its claws gleaming, and traced slow, deliberate lines in the air. And then it turned to Sean. Sean stood frozen in the circle, his face pale, his lips slightly parted as if he wanted to scream but couldn't. The demon glided toward him, its molten eyes locking onto him with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Sean trembled, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The creature reached out, its clawed hand moving with agonizing slowness. When it touched Sean's chest, I expected him to recoil, to cry out, but he didn't. Instead, he stood there, rigid, as if he were under a spell. The light from the circle pulsed again, and suddenly, Sean's body jerked violently. His head snapped back, and his mouth opened in a silent scream, as the golden light in the demon's eyes seemed to flow into him. For a moment, it was like Sean's entire body was glowing from the inside out, the light coursing through him, illuminating his veins and bones in a horrifying display. And then, with a flash so bright it burned my vision, the light was gone. Sean collapsed to the ground, limp and lifeless. His eyes stared blankly ahead, the spark that made him Sean extinguished. The demon tilted its head slightly, as if admiring its work. It straightened, its claws flexing, and turned its gaze to the rest of the room. The robed figures began chanting again, louder and more frenzied than before, their voices filled with a strange, feverish joy. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there, but I couldn't move. All I could do was watch as the creature's grin seemed to widen even further, as if it were basking in its victory. Its molten eyes scanned the room, and for one horrifying moment, they landed on me. The pressure in the air grew unbearable, and I felt something deep in my chest, a pull, like it was reaching for me too. I stumbled back, breaking whatever trance I'd been in, and I realized with a sickening certainty that if I stayed any longer, I wouldn't leave this room alive. As the chanting rose to an ear-splitting crescendo, I turned and bolted for the door, leaving Sean behind. But even as I ran, I could feel that smile, that awful, jagged grin burning itself into my mind. It wasn't over. Not yet. I don't know how I made it to the hallway. My legs moved on instinct, carrying me away from the chanting, the flashing light, and Sean's lifeless body. My mind screamed at me to keep going, to get out of the house, to get as far away as I could. But then I saw her. Janice was standing at the end of the dimly lit corridor, leaning casually against the wall, like she'd been waiting for me. Her face was calm, almost serene, and her lips curled into a small, knowing smile as I approached. "You're leaving so soon?" she asked, her voice light and conversational, as if we'd just finished a pleasant dinner instead of witnessing the nightmare unfolding in the other room. I froze, my chest heaving with panic. What the hell is going on in there?" I stammered. "What did you do to Sean?" Her smile didn't falter. If anything, it widened slightly, as though she were amused by my fear. "Sean's fine," she said smoothly. "Better than fine, actually. He's been chosen for something greater, something you wouldn't understand." "Chosen?" I repeated, my voice cracking. "You call that thing greater? He's dead, Janice. You killed him." She sighed softly, shaking her head like a disappointed parent. You're thinking too small. You see a sacrifice. I see an investment. Money, power, freedom, all the things this world takes from people like us. I did what any good mother would do. Her tone was so matter-of-fact, so confident, that it made my stomach turn. Sean didn't ask for this, I shouted, my voice trembling. He trusted you, and you... I gave him everything, she interrupted, her voice suddenly sharper. Do you have any idea what it takes to survive in this world? To thrive? Money is everything. Power is everything. And this was his chance to have it all. Her gaze softened slightly, and for a moment, there was something almost tender in her expression. He was ready for this. I'm proud of him, she said. Proud to be part of his first experience, his first freak-off. The way she said it, with that strange, unsettling pride, sent a chill down my spine. You're insane, I whispered. Her smile returned, cold and unshakable. No, she said. I'm a mother. I couldn't stay there any longer. I turned and ran, her words echoing in my mind. As I stumbled out into the cool night air, I realized they weren't just words. They were a warning, a promise, and a curse all at once. Even as I put distance between myself and that house, I knew I'd never truly escape her or the horrors she'd unleashed. She didn't just create the legend of Diddy, she cursed him with it. And yet, as much as I wanted to hate him, I couldn't. I'd seen the real Sean once, the boy who idolized his mom and wanted to make her proud, the boy who cracked jokes, ran faster than anyone, and trusted me to have his back. That Sean was gone long before the world met Diddy. Janice had made sure of that. I turned off the TV, but the images wouldn't leave me. I couldn't stop hearing her voice, calm and chilling. He's been chosen. Now I finally understood what she meant. As the story ends, I want to hear from you. Do you think success